My name is Gideon Strauss. I am Associate Professor in Worldview Studies at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, Canada. And this is a microsymposium on Google Hangout and YouTube. Our theme is Art and Pilgrimage. This is one of a series of such broadcasts that's connected to the Wayfinding project of the Institute for Christian Studies. And I'm delighted to have three guests join me today to talk about art and pilgrimage: Rebekah Smick, Lisa Deam, and Michael Wright. And so, Rebekah, Lisa, and Michael, could you introduce yourselves a little?
Starting with myself? Okay. Shall I carry on?
We're live.
Okay. Thanks, Gideon. So my name is Rebekah Smick, and I teach, I'm an associate professor of philosophy of art and culture at the Institute for Christian Studies. I had my training as an art historian, first at Columbia University and then at the University of Toronto. And I went from being a modernist to being sort of a Renaissance and Baroque scholar who pursued the critical literature of art, the development of the critical literature of art as it blossomed, shall we say, in the Renaissance period. And that led me to look at the literature that fueled the Western aesthetics tradition as it developed as a separate branch of philosophy in the 18th century. So that is my orientation. Sorry?
I'm asking Lisa to introduce herself.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Lisa Deam, and I'm happy to be here. I have a PhD in medieval art history from the University of Chicago. These days I write and speak about spiritual formation through the realm of history and art. I'm interested in what the ancient and medieval church has to teach us about our journey today. And I have a book that was published last year, kind of on this topic, and it's called The World Transformed, Studying the Spirituality of Medieval Maps. And Gideon, did you want me to go ahead and talk about a little about my experience with pilgrimage?
Why don't we give Michael an opportunity to introduce himself, and then we go back to you, Lisa, and you can talk about pilgrimage stuff. So Michael, if you could introduce yourself.
Hey guys, my name is Michael Wright. I got a master's from Fuller Seminary in Theology and the Arts, and I now work in the marketing department as an associate editor on Fuller Magazine and Fuller Studio. So we're creating content for a deeply formed spiritual life, and that's been interesting to be a part of. So I'm always interested in looking for art forms that help support and enhance people's spiritual lives, especially through times of darkness and suffering. So,
thank you, Rebekah, Lisa, and Michael. Lisa, so your experience with pilgrimage, tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, the medieval maps that I have studied and write about in my book are really what got me interested in pilgrimage. Because one of the main maps, called the Hereford map, shows 4 major pilgrimage sites from the 13th and 14th centuries and actually beyond. And those are 4 sites that are still important today. They are Hereford Cathedral itself, the Shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, the city of Rome, and of course, Jerusalem. Now, I have to confess that I have not been on any of these pilgrimage routes, and I like to blame my children for that, because at about the time I started to become really interested in pilgrimage, I found myself with young children. And as you either know or have heard, children are a journey all their own. I would really like to walk the Camino de Santiago one day, the Way of St. James. And that's largely because I feel like this is one route that would replicate, to some extent, the medieval experience of pilgrimage, because you can still walk the old roads on that route today. So that's one of my dreams in terms of pilgrimage. But what I'm really interested in is how pilgrimage can help us understand our spiritual journey. So some people enrich their spirituality today by taking a pilgrimage. I like to delve into the past. I like to look into medieval pilgrimage for insight on our spiritual lives and our spiritual journey. And I firmly believe that time travel is an important kind of pilgrimage. And I have other works of art that I can talk about, but I figure we'll get to those in a few minutes.
Yes, we will. We are going to race a little bit because we started late today, primarily because of technical difficulties on my end. So my apologies for that to each of you and also to those who are viewing us live. We will have to finish strictly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time or 10 a.m. Pacific Time because Michael and others of us have obligations and logistical challenges as well. So we'll go as fast as we can. But Lisa, you've spoken a bit about pilgrimage in your experience. I wonder, Michael and Rebekah, have you been on pilgrimages? Are there pilgrimages that you would like to go on? I'm more of a migratory creature than a pilgrim. So I find myself traveling between my native South Africa and Canada, where I live and work at the moment, with some frequency. But that has, while it's a significant reality in all of my life, it's not really pilgrimage. So how about you, Michael, Rebekah?
Yeah, I've had the chance to go on a couple different, I would call them pilgrimages. The two that really stuck to mind, one where I visited Meteora, which is a collection of monasteries in central Greece that are all built on these raised rock formations. And you can still tour them today, and many of them are still in use. And the other pilgrimage, I visited John Frame's studio. John Frame is a sculptor I deeply respect, and I contacted him. He lives an hour outside of LA, and he was willing, and he let me come to his studio and stay the night and see all his artwork there. And so those two are very different. One Greek Orthodox, one artist, but they both have that shared sense of heightened awareness that you get when you're on a pilgrimage. You experience something, you're dislocated from your life, you're out in the world, and your senses are heightened. And in that heightened space, you can, I think you're more porous to the world as it already is. It's not like you go on pilgrimage to find something that isn't available to you where you are right now. It's more, for me, like this experience that you go on to kind of peel back the veil a little bit that's already available for you to do, but you just kind of need that dislocation to help you. So.
What about you, Rebekah?
Yeah, well, I hesitate to call my touristic, my travel experiences true pilgrimages. I've spent a considerable amount of time walking at different parts of what's called St. Francis's Way, which goes between Florence and Rome, and connects Assisi and the various parts of St. Francis's experience as he became, from his conversion to his stigmatization to his death. So I've walked along there, and I've walked towards Bolsena, which is where the famous Mass of Bolsena occurred. I've also been to Jerusalem, been to the church, well, walked on the Via Dolorosa, which is the Way of Sorrows that leads, which I think since the Middle Ages has been incorporated into the pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Also to the Mount of Transfiguration, Mount Tabor, the sort of traditional site for Christ's Transfiguration, and the Mount of Beatitudes. And I haven't what I would like to do at some point is to treat it more in the pilgrimage spirit, rather than the touristic one that I'm a learner, so but I'd like to do more of that. But having said that, I think the experience of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Rome, it's really hard not to feel as though you are a pilgrim yourself, because everyone you are there with is in the spirit of pilgrimage. They are there to reenact in an imitative fashion, the whole life and death of Christ. So for them, that is holy ground, and it's hard. Either you in that spirit or you're not. So it's very interesting.
I'm struck by that partly because on a very small scale I've experienced that reenactment by praying the stations of the Cross at a monastery that in a sense provided a little micro pilgrimage, a walking experience of reenactment that for me connected me with the meaning of the death of Christ in significant ways. Michael, I was struck by your pilgrimage to the sculptor's studio, and it reminded me of similar experience. Rebekah will know our colleague emeritus, Calvin Seerveld, and I read Seerveld's book, Rainbows for the Fallen World, in the mid-1980s in South Africa. And so the first time that I visited Cal's home and went down to his basement office, which is a real shrine to the academic life, to me that felt like a real pilgrimage. Like I went somewhere that had this heightened sense of meaning that connected for me with the meaning of my own journey. So I'm wondering how each of you would, how do you make sense of pilgrimage? What for you is the meaning of pilgrimage as a thing that one does?
Did you say me?
Anyone can go, but Lisa first. What do you think? Lisa?
Okay. So what pilgrimage might mean?
Yeah.
Okay, well, if it's okay, how about if I use a painting to kind of go into what, for me, pilgrimage is all about? Does that sound okay? I'm going to run over to screen share. And here we go. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned, my approach to pilgrimage is pretty historical. I like to reach the spiritual through the historical. And so for me, this painting I love because it refers to 3 different kinds of pilgrimage, and it all relates back to us. Now, this painting is the Marode altarpiece by the Flemish artist Robert Campin. It dates to about 1432. And in the central panel, I'm not going to talk too much about that, we see a scene of the Annunciation to Mary. What I want to focus on a little more is the left-hand panel, in which you see a young Flemish couple kneeling at the doorway to the Annunciation, and they're in a position of prayer. Now, this is the young couple that owned the painting, and if we look at the left panel, it may be a little hard to see, but what happens is this couple has come from the city that we get a little view of in the background, and they have gone through a gate that leads into the enclosed garden, and they've walked down a little path to reach the doorway to the Annunciation. So they have taken a journey to get to where they are right now. And this sort of evokes the idea of a traditional physical pilgrimage. Perhaps the most basic definition of pilgrimage in the Christian tradition is a journey to a shrine or another sacred place. And pilgrimage was a very common spiritual practice in the Middle Ages. So this painting then might evoke the practice of pilgrimage that was so common, for example, pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to sites where the great events of the Christian faith took place. Now let me show you one more layer of physical pilgrimage, and that is the figure of the man standing in the very back by the gate. And that has been identified by some scholars as the artist himself, as Robert Campin. And what's interesting is that around the time this was painted, Campin himself was a pilgrim. He was sentenced to go to Saint-Gilles, which is a shrine along the Camino de Santiago. He was sent there for some so-called political crimes. So his was a penitential pilgrimage, almost an exile. And that's so interesting because it shows that there are so many kinds of pilgrimage in the Christian tradition and in history, that it's not a monolithic category. So you could travel to a shrine to pray, but you might also be sent on a pilgrimage by a religious authority or the courts even. So standing at the threshold to this garden, in the very back of the painting, this man, perhaps Campin, seems to usher the young couple onto their pilgrimage. And I think he does the same for us as a viewer. He's inviting us into the enclosed garden and taking us to this scene of the Annunciation. And that brings me to the third kind of pilgrimage that we see in this painting, and that is a spiritual journey. So perhaps the young couple shown in the painting did go on a physical pilgrimage, but maybe instead they're on a spiritual journey, and they are being granted this vision of the Annunciation through their prayers. This was a very common theme in the Middle Ages. Physical and spiritual pilgrimage were so intertwined. So when we read medieval authors or theologians talking about a spiritual journey or a spiritual pilgrimage, they had a real physical journey in mind in the background. And reading about medieval pilgrimage, I can tell you it was such a difficult and even a dangerous journey. People really risked everything to go to a place like the Holy Land. And this physical reality of this journey, I think, can speak to us today. And it makes it an important image for us, pilgrimage as a spiritual journey. The difficulties of pilgrimage kind of describe the discomfort of our own spiritual journey. It can be a way to recognize the hardships we go through. And someone that's been on a long pilgrimage today could probably tell you about the physical difficulties. But it's also an image that fills us with hope, because at the end of our pilgrimage is our destination, and we know that we're going to reach it. So if we follow that winding road, we know we'll reach the place we are seeking. So I think that's an important image of difficulty and hope for us as individuals in our own formation, and I think it's an important guiding image too for the church today. And I'm back.
Thank you, Lisa.
So
Michael and Rebekah, that was great, because it was lovely for me to look at the painting that Lisa was using and hear her sort of explication of the painting, and she made sense of pilgrimage for herself. How about you? What sense do you make of the meaning of pilgrimage? Michael?
Rebekah, go for it.
Sorry, was that Michael going?
No, go for it. You can go first.
Okay. I'm going to try as well to do the Google share here and get an image up. And that's not the, so
Pick that one.
pick that one. This one, and then I can scroll through.
Then you go over there to scroll. First you share.
Okay, I'm going to be.
Then you go over there.
This.
Yeah. See, it's hidden the thing that you scroll on.
This is also an example of coaching.
Yes.
Coaching.
You can scroll to whichever one you want.
Okay. So can we? I can go with that one.
Sure. It's already displaying. You can see there.
Right. Okay. This is an image of Saint Francis in ecstasy, it's called, and it's from the Basilica of Saint Francis, San Francesco, in Assisi, painted, attributed to Giotto, painted around 1297, 1300 to 1300. And I picked this one because it the paintings in this series were based upon St. Bonaventure's life of St. Francis. It was called the Legenda Maior. And they choose, the painters or the artists chose a couple of really important moments in Francis's life that I think are essential to how we understand how pilgrimage operates. And this one is, Francis was really hoping to be able to be a martyr. And that comes out in St. Bonaventure's account. And the desire of a martyr is to allow oneself to enter into the experience of Christ completely. So which is a death. So his hope was to do this, and he suffered tremendous austerities. And at different moments he had quite, a tremendous amount of poor ill health in his life, but he never approached martyrdom, even though he prayed to approach martyrdom. But in this, as he was going through his life, at one point he did receive an ecstatic experience of union with God and union with the divine. So this is a mystical experience, and here he is experiencing this ecstasy, where he throws his arms out in sort of a cross-like shape, where basically he's undertaking in a kind of moment of ecstatic suffering the experience of Christ on the cross. So the fundamental theme that makes this kind of approach to the pilgrimage function is this notion of imitation, of reenacting somehow the life of the saint that you're following. So in fact, all of the scenes that are painted in the upper church of San Francesco tell us the life of Saint Francis in imitation of the life of Christ. And here we have this kind of moment of union with Christ that comes through a kind of ecstatic mystical experience. So the aim, shall we say, of his entire life's journey, ultimately. And then, if I can move on to, oops, not this one. But here is maybe the culmination of this entire approach, again, to imitation, where finally Francis receives the stigmata. He has a vision of the crucified Christ contained in a seraph, and in Bonaventure there's a tremendous amount of attention paid to how the imagination works and how important imagery is to our imaginative experience. So to have a vision of the crucified Christ becomes part of his way of knowing through experience God. So it's a knowledge of God that is also coming through this kind of visual experience of a vision of the crucifix. And again, in an completely imitative mode, this is where Francis receives the stigmata. So he takes on the very wounds of Christ and becomes one with him, right? Through an empathic suffering that he shares. He becomes one with Christ's mission for humanity. So though in terms of how this connection between pilgrimage and our life's journey, I think this notion of invitation is a fairly fundamental one that leads to this kind of total spiritual experience. So I will try to move back to or pass the torch to Michael.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think between the three of us, we have just a variety of approaches to pilgrimage that all kind of add complexity to the idea in a really good way. I'm going to screen share as well. I have two images I'd like to share with you. Let's see here. So, do you see that image by chance?
Yes.
Great. So this image is Mark Tansey's painting The Key, and you can see it's just like husband, wife, laid out late at night after an evening, and he's searching through his keys, trying to find his way to get back in. What's interesting about this painting is that's Gilberti's Doors of Paradise that he's resting his hands on. And the Doors of Paradise are a masterpiece in sculpture that depicts scenes out of the Bible. You also see the angel who's guarding the way in a sculpture up top, and also the snake. I've always been interested in this image because what's happening is they are locked outside of Eden, and what's keeping them locked outside of Eden is a depiction, a representation of Eden. So for me, like, that's this really interesting kind of dialectic thing between art and what we want art to do. Sometimes there are paintings and films and songs that help guide me in my spiritual life, and then other times they're also the very thing that blocks me from it. You know, you think of films like God's Not Dead or something like that. Like, it's a representation that's supposed to, in their own way, guide people towards faith, but it's actually blocking them from it. So I think that's really interesting. How it relates to pilgrimage, it's a little, maybe a loose connection, but the thing I really want to say about pilgrimage, I don't know if you guys have seen this film, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. In this film, Walter is an office worker at New York Times, just working with photos of a travel photographer. So his life is just dull and passionless, and he sees all these photos from this travel photographer all the time, and all these bizarre and beautiful landscapes. So, as films do, of course, he is thrust into an adventure to go and find himself as he goes on all these adventures for himself. And on the surface, it seems like, oh, this is a celebration of pilgrimage. But I think one of my fears or reservations about pilgrimage is believing that somehow it requires that internal spiritual change requires something that's out there, something that's far away, something that's beyond the self. And that is, that's just concerning to me, having grown up in multiple circumstances, kind of being sold a bill of goods. Like, if you go at this church camp, this is going to change your life. If you go on this mission trip, this will change your life. If you buy a plane ticket and go to the Holy Lands, this will change your life. And so I worry about the commodification of pilgrimage and the overemphasis on an external location as a place of change. And so I'll just end with these few comments with this parable. There's a lovely parable about a beggar who sits outside a temple. He's begging every day, and he gets a coin. And next day he'll get another coin. And this goes on for a year, and he gets a coin about every day. And then he continues, and through his whole life he's sitting right outside this temple, and he begs every day just for meager amounts of pay. When he dies, they remove his body and they realize he was sitting on a box. They open up the box, and it was filled with thousands and thousands and thousands of gold coins. And I love that parable because I think so often we're reaching outward for things when what we really need to do is have the courage to go on an interior pilgrimage that can absolutely be facilitated by these experiences that we've been describing, but are not controlled by them or do not require us to have these experiences to go on that interior pilgrimage. So.
Thank you, Michael. We have 5 more minutes left, and what I'm thinking of asking the 3 of you to respond briefly is that as I've looked at the images that you've shared and listened to the ways in which you've made use of those images to talk about pilgrimage, what stood out for me was the significance of imagination. And so, Rebekah, for example, listening to you talk about the historical reality that pilgrimage has often been understood as imitation. So going on a physical journey that in some way allows the pilgrim to imitate the life journey of Christ, or for other pilgrims to follow the journey over a lifetime of a saint, and by following that journey, in a sense also imitating the life of the saint, reenacting imaginatively the life of the saint. And so, given that, I wonder if you could each briefly say something about how art, either in its making or in its experiencing, can function like pilgrimage. You know, how our experience of an artwork of one or another kind might engage us imaginatively in a way that takes us on a journey that connects us to the meaning of things, and that helps us also to make sense of our own lives. Does art work for you imaginatively as a means to make sense of your life journey?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and start. I think so. Meister Eckhart has a quote I love. He says, "The soul projects itself outward into created acts in order to understand itself." And I think whether you're making it or you're receiving it, the experience of art is one of coming to a deeper understanding of aspects of yourself that are larger than your rational and linguistic capacity. So you read a poem and you don't understand it, but you keep reading it and you keep reading it, and then you find your consciousness has changed through that experience, because that poem pulls yourself towards new insights you would have never gotten otherwise. Or you write a song that starts as a felt pressure near your heart, but then as you write it, it begins to take form outside of yourself that then gives you insight into your own experience and then can help other people do the same. So not all art does that. You know, Jeff Koons' paintings and sculptures don't necessarily create any kind of spiritual warmth inside myself, but there are artists who do that. I think for those who do, that experience of art is really profound and useful.
I agree. One thing I love about the image of pilgrimage is that it tells us that we don't travel alone, and that we're all on the road together. And Michael, I think, in a Wait chat from earlier this year, quoted that great line from Ram Dass, "We're all just walking each other home." And what do we do as we walk along with each other? We sing songs to each other. We tell each other stories, and we paint great pictures. And in that way, we help one another, find the way. And it's not that every picture we paint or story we tell is about self-referentially about the journey, but kind of like Michael said, that it's a way in. If you think of Chaucer's Pilgrims, telling one another stories along the way. It's another way to help us find our way through. And it doesn't necessarily, I don't think art necessarily tells us what to believe or how to get there. And the thing I love about that painting that I shared is that when I came face to face with it and needed it to tell me something, it didn't tell me what to believe, but it sort of, took me on a journey and kind of deposited me at the threshold, and it more like asked a question: do you believe? Where are you on this journey? So yes, I think maybe one way for that to describe that is the imagination, the ability of art to take you on a journey like that, or to ask you questions to help you find the way, and that's something that we do for each other as we walk along the road.
Rebekah, you have the last word.
I have the last word. Okay, again, I'm going to give an image. This is by Francisco de Goya, and it's taken from his book Caprichos, so this is the end of the 18th century. And what it says below there is that the sleep of reason produces phantoms, produces monsters. So you have a person there who's fallen asleep, and out of his imagination comes these. Well, they're not monsters; they're fantasies. And the entire quote it goes like this: "Fantasy abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters, but united with reason, fantasy is the mother of the arts and the origin of their marvels." And this, shall we say, maybe puts a long tradition of how the imagination is understood to operate in conjunction with reason. Imagination, I think, if I would take the point of connection I see between pilgrimage and our work as artists, it comes out very specifically in the Divine Comedy, where Dante is making his own pilgrimage from, imitating the harrowing of hell, where he goes into the abyss and then climbs up Mount Purgatory and then arrives to the face of God. But his project is again exemplary insofar as his guide there is a poet named Virgil, and it's Virgil's own imaginative capacities as to guide Dante in his own work, which is to create art that can move one like the sort of objective things that he is experiencing in his own journey. So he accepts, so constantly throughout the Divine Comedy, Dante is telling us how he's failing as an artist because he worries that he won't be able to make this exemplary recreation of his own embodied experience of his own pilgrimage. So the artist, in that understanding, has almost a ministerial role to create things that can be compelling in the way that our own journey through life is compelling, and we become each other's exemplars as we move, forward in our own movement towards some kind of experience that is an aesthetic one, that is a compelling one in that sense, that moves us in a profound way. So to come back just for 2 seconds to this image by Goya. So Goya here, there is always this dynamic between reason and imagination in the Western tradition. And even Plato raises it, who didn't like the poets very much. But he raises it to suggest that imagination has this special capacity, a creative capacity, still fundamentally based in images that are connected to our embodied selves, our emotional selves, our selves that can be give us knowledge of things that reason may not be able to completely cover. Notions like God, and notions like justice, and notions that are impossible to to reason about in specific ways. So the imagination has this particular capacity. So that I will stop with that.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Lisa, for helping us think a little bit about art and pilgrimage. I have 100 questions coming out of the things that we've said, and we'd love to continue our conversation around imagination and meditation, about the journey of our lives and the physical journeys of pilgrimage. And we might be able to have some of those conversations on Twitter as we continue with the Wayfinders conversations. But today, I must say thank you to you and goodbye, and I look forward to future conversations.